Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening. Great to have your company as always. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. More bad news for the bumbling Chris Bowen's green agenda. Yet another lofty target unlikely to be met. This time it's electric vehicles, with less than a third of Labor's predicted uptake being met. Farmers yet again in the sides of environmental zealots, with one activist charity accused of bullying farmers over what they allege is illegal land clearing. It's gone so far that the Nationals are now calling for a review of the Australian Conservation Foundation's charitable tax status. Plus, parents fed up with the inept response of the Victorian government when it comes to those planned school strikes for Palestine this week. It's time this nonsense was called out and kids have stopped being used as political footballs when it comes to something they know nothing about. And another day, and again the Prime Minister's on the back foot over what he said or didn't say to President Xi over the naval incident that saw Australian divers injured. This just adds to the growing sense that Labor are a government asleep at the wheel on national security.
The PM gets tricky with his words. I think the test here is whether he can just be upfront and honest and open. Did he say, these words to President Xi, or if not, if he didn't, then apologise. Just admit you've made a mistake, but be honest.
But first, apart from telling everyone that he wasn't Scott Morrison, the only real commitments that Anthony Albanese made at last year's election were to raise real wages and to cut your power bill by $275 a year. Now, essentially, he said he could achieve the cut at power bills to the power bill by massively increasing renewable power. Plus, he said there'd be 604,000 new green jobs, with Labor's plan to get emissions down by 43% by 2030 and to achieve net zero by 2050. And one of the ways Labor's been able to get away with their lie that renewables will make power cheaper is because on the face of it, it's got a ring of truth. After all, the sun's free and so is the wind. So you can understand voters, at least early on, buying Labor's spin. That is, of course, until the reality rolls out into a community where they live. Because to get to its target of 80% renewables by 2030, this means the installation of 22,000 new solar panels every single day, a large new wind turbine every single month for 7 years, plus building at least 10,000 kilometres of new transmission lines by 2030. Lines which Labor costed pre-election at some $80 billion. Now, we all know how this is turning out, don't we? I mean, far from falling, most people's power bills are actually up 20% over the past 12 months. The energy regulator is warning of blackouts this summer, and all the new renewables and the power lines have farmers and conservationists up in arms about the damage to prime agricultural land and the destruction too of our wildlife, not to mention the beauty of our landscape and oceans marred by acres of wind towers that we've just left to rust in place after their usual life of 15 years. Now, the latest looming failure in this energy policy train wreck is electric cars. Pre-election, Labor told us that 89% of new vehicle sales would be electric by 2030. Why this was something for emissions obsessives to boast about is a mystery, given that these are largely coal-fired cars, because coal is still 60% of our power supply, don't forget. But like all Labor's energy policy commitments, this one too is turning out to be a pipe dream. In the Senate recently, a senior transport official said that new car sales are now expected to be just 27% electric, not the 89% boasted by the government at the end of the decade. If that. The forecaster, Reputex, this is the forecaster, of course, that Labor relied on pre-election, now tells the Australian newspaper today that EVs will only be somewhere between 20 or 30% of total car sales by 2030. So much for the modelling that they put their faith in pre-election. Mind you, of course, this is the same mob that Labor used who went out there and said they could save you $275 off your power bill. So Reputex ain't that reputable. But you can see where this is all heading, can't you? Despite high fuel prices and despite tax concessions, people aren't buying electric cars in the numbers needed because they're roughly double the cost of conventional vehicles. And of course, they need lengthy charging every couple of 100 kilometres. So what will Labor do? Bring in fuel efficiency standard, I suspect, that will take most petrol and diesel cars off the market. That's the threat. In other words, force you into electric cars, whether you like it or not, whether they work for you or not. But this is modern Labor. Inner city elites who barely drive 10Ks a day, if that, preferenced over people in the suburbs or regions who need to drive greater distances just to get to work or live life. And as for anything becoming cheaper under Labor, well, forget it. The only player who ends up ahead here is China, because it's their cars, their solar panels, their wind turbines that we will pay billions and billions to import, giving their workers jobs, using our coal and our gas to power their factories. The very same resources, of course, that we can't use here because we're so obsessed about emissions. Australia, don't forget, we're responsible for around 1% of global emissions. And China, well, far and away, they're the world's biggest emitter. Now, if our Prime Minister can't even take China to task for injuring our naval personnel, honestly, what hope do we have to win the looming economic or energy war? Look, one of the reasons the government's in a world of economic pain at the moment is because it can't seem to make anything better. The government has admitted the NDIS, the so-called National Disability Insurance Scheme, it's not an insurance scheme, they've admitted it's out of control, with numbers way beyond forecasts and costs skyrocketing. But given that this is Labor's main signature since Medicare, no one has the courage in Labor to rein it in, or even to admit there are fundamental problems with the scheme. Now, the aim when it was created was to give people with lifelong, life-changing disabilities the services needed to live normally. But too many people are covered and too many services are on offer. Not all of them as well have lifelong, seriously life-changing disabilities. And not all of them really need so many of the suite of taxpayer-funded activities, such as carers taking them out on the taxpayer to the movies. Because NDIS payments are basically uncapped, so not limited like most other government payments, everyone with a disability wants to be on the scheme, and because everyone wants to be on it, it costs a hell of a lot more. Participation is now 600,000, heading towards 1 million. Not the 460,000 forecast. Costs are now over 40 billion a year, headed north to 100 billion, not the 25 billion originally forecast. Now, to put that into perspective, that's more than the total cost of Medicare, which services all 25 million Australians, not just the 600,000 like the NDIS. With the NDIS set to cost more than our entire defence budget in the near future, Labor ministers say they'll just limit spending growth to just 8% a year. But with the latest revelation that 12% of all Australian boys aged between 5 and 7, mostly for autism or developmental delay, are on the NDIS, 5% of our girls too at the same age, there's not the slightest sign of any of the needed changes to bring this about. The Minister, Bill Shorten, says there should be alternatives to the NDIS for kids with autism. Now, fat chance of the state stepping up and doing this, and even if they did, it would largely be just cost shifting from one jurisdiction to another. What's needed is restrictions on who is eligible and limits on what participants get under the NDIS. But that would require tough political decisions. It would likely infuriate the disability lobby, parents particularly, not to mention all the businesses now making a very good living off the NDIS as service providers. Because the hardest thing in politics is scaling back or abolishing something once it's created, It's vital that all new programs can be exhaustively examined before they're ever introduced. It's fitting, though, that the person who introduced this overhyped and over-generous scheme, the NDIS, back when he was the Parliamentary Secretary, Bill Shorten, now is the Minister, and he has to wear the blame if it isn't fixed. All right, let's go to Canberra with the headlines. Joining us now, Sky News political reporter Joel Philp.
Good evening. Beijing has rejected the government's account of a Navy incident in which Australian divers were injured by sonar pulses from a Chinese warship. This is the latest of 3 provocative acts by the Chinese military against Australia in the past 2 years.
These are not the acts of a friend.
While the injured Navy divers had been cleared to return to work, the opposition says the Prime Minister should have confronted Chinese President Xi Jinping about the issue when the pair met face-to-face at APEC last week.
We're not going to be taken seriously if we won't even raise it peer-to-peer, man-to-man, through the Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister has refused to reveal the details of what he calls a private conversation with President Xi on the APEC sidelines in San Francisco.
Did he raise the issue or he didn't? Just be open and honest with the Australian public.
The Chinese Defence Ministry has denied it took any action which caused harm to Australian divers and is accusing the government of stoking tensions.
I hope the relevant parties will stop causing trouble at China's doorstep and work with China to jointly maintain the momentum of improvement and development of China-Australia relations.
While the government is unlikely to engage in an ongoing public spat over the incident, as it tries to mend relations with China, the opposition argues propaganda should be called out.
It's propaganda and we shouldn't abide it for a second.
Minutes just released from the Reserve Bank's latest meeting reveal the central bank is willing to hike rates again if inflation or economic data comes in too hot. RBA Governor Michelle Bullock told ASIC's annual conference today that inflation remains the crucial challenge facing Australia's economy over the next 2 years.
Although you want to look through supply shocks, if you keep getting them, there comes a point where everyone just expects inflation to remain high, and if inflation expectations adjust, then that's a problem.
One economist analysing the day's developments believes the bank probably won't hike rates in December.
While we should be under no illusion that there could be high rates, I'm not sure that they're in a big rush.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers has talked up Australia's standing compared to its peers around the world.
Among all of the countries that we compare ourselves with, we are in a better position than most, if not all, of those countries.
All right, joining me now, a lot to get through, Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. I have to say, mate, you're my favourite guest on a Tuesday because you've always got something pretty interesting to say, and sometimes we have a little bit of a differing view, and I love that. I think that's really important in politics. Give me a sense of where the government is on this whole issue with China and national security, because, you know, it's clear our divers were injured. It's clear this happened on Tuesday. Nothing was said in the Parliament. The PM goes off to APEC. He meets in the sidelines with Xi Jinping. We can't get a straight answer from him whether he said something to the President or not. Clearly yesterday, I listened to that interview with Kieran Gilbert, and when he talks about we did this and we did that, well, that says that he didn't do it. That's political code to me. China says, though, even though they admit something happened, they deny they did anything wrong. What's your take?
Well, my take is he hasn't handled it as well as he could have. I mean, he had the opportunity yesterday with Kieran to say, I did say something, you know, but I won't go into private conversations. Why didn't he? I mean, my understanding is he said something. I'm not sure whether it was to Wang Yi or Xi, but to the Chinese leadership about it. How could he not, given it happened last Tuesday? But it looks like they've been secretive about it to the extent they wanted it out after he departed San Francisco. And, you know, Dutton's able to portray him as weak because it looks like he might not have said something. So I just think, to be honest, that and the immigration story of last week, I think since The Voice, he's lost a bit of mojo, and so's the government. And I think that's where we're at. I mean, he'll get asked about this in Parliament. I think if he did say something to the Chinese leadership, he could say, I did say something to the Chinese leadership. I'm not saying what it is. I'm not repeating private conversations, but I'll always stand up for Australia's interests. Some of this stuff is so elementary, I'm a bit surprised the PM's not doing it, just as I was surprised they were a bit flat-footed on the immigration stuff last week. For those of us who've observed politics for a while, you know what it's like, Peter. You know the type of scenario you're in, and you know what the general political reaction is. And he's not even getting that right at the moment, I don't think.
I think he's making a meal of it, though, because I agree with him. He doesn't have to say what was said in the private conversation. But surely on an issue this significant, the injury to Australian military, doing what the international community has authorised them to do, that deserves raising with a leader you happen to cross paths with within days of the actual event. To not do that, it's a character flaw in the Prime Minister. It shows weakness at a time when I think we're looking at him, given this issue with the detention issue, and wondering whether he's got the mettle to be a leader. And look at that news poll today, not the news poll, sorry, a Roy Morgan poll. That Roy Morgan poll picks up your point. I think he's been tracking down since The Voice. And that poll has the coalition now leading Labor on the 2PP, two-party preferred basis. Resolve poll yesterday, it's basically flipped the numbers in support of a treaty. A treaty was almost two-thirds of the Australian vote back in October, 58%, dropped to 33% this month. He's not clear on where we stand in relation to Makarrata. You've got Australians in a financial world of pain, sweating on whether there'll be another rate rise just before Christmas. And then you've got not just the issue with these detainees in the community, but I guess all the other stuff that's coming around the mass migration of people into this country, and premiers today saying not enough is being done. So, world of pain in summary, where does he go from here?
Well, he needs to get some confidence back, doesn't he? I mean, they have a few things they're going to roll out. The migration strategy, that'll be interesting given the context of what you just said, the cybersecurity strategy and the NDIS reforms, but they've got to get those through the states, and that will require the states stumping up money, and you know how hard it is to get money out of the states. Look, the problem with the approach of the government, I think, this year is they have all these reviews, which they obviously set up so they could be talking about something, seen to do something. They do an announcement of the review, and then the next day it disappears. Where's the narrative of the government? They were able to mask over that for a little while with The Voice. It's really mixed up at the moment, and that's where you lose some paint. Look, I don't rely. Roy Morgan's not as reliable as news poll, right? But most of the polls show that the primary's coming off Labor. It's not showing, incidentally, that primary's always going the coalition. And when I talk to Liberal people, this is their concern, that Dutton is making headway and getting the vote off Labor. It's just not going to the Liberals yet. Of course, that can happen.
Yeah, but can I just jump in there? Yeah, can I just jump in that?
Yeah.
Calm down, nervous Nellies. The Liberal nervous Nellies always come at that line, right? And that'll be the moderates saying that because Dutton's a Conservative. You've got to take the vote off Labor first. It's got to move off the incumbent, the vote does, before it'll ever come your way. It can come to us on the right in a staged process. It sometimes gets parked with the others. It might move across. We're only, 18 months into the new government. For it to come off the government as fast as it has in the back half of this year, I think that's very telling.
Yes.
And I'd be making it my job in the first half of next year to migrate that vote that's leaving Labor. We know it's leaving Labor. Migrate that into Liberal or National Party camp.
All right, but Bill Shorten got votes off the Liberals with Turnbull, but never converted it. So that's the issue. It does occur. That sort of situation does occur.
The Drover's dog could have got votes off Turnbull. The Drover's dog could have got votes on Turnbull. I mean, I think this will be really interesting to see how it plays out between now and the budget.
You famously called him Mr. Harborside Mansion.
I wasn't wrong.
It was the best line of the campaign.
To the Liberal Party. We won a Logie for it, mate. Let's go to the Liberal Party in New South Wales. Marise Payne, of course, she was the Senate leader at one stage. She's certainly the senator there, foreign minister, of course. She's leaving the parliament. Peter Dutton is backing Zed Seselja, formerly a Canberra-based ACT senator. He's one of the Conservatives in the race. There are multiple. There's a woman, her name's Monica Tudor-Hope. The Business Council's backing her, and former Premier Perrottet's backing her as well. There's a moderate, former New South Wales Transport Minister Andrew Constance. He quit state politics to run for a federal seat, lost that, can't get a job clearly, wants another go at it. He's a moderate. So too is Dave Sharma, who lost the seat of Wentworth. He wants the Senate as well. Goodness me, a lot of failed state politicians there, failed politicians. Monica Tudor-Hope is about the only clean skin. How's it going to play out?
Well, very dangerous to pick a New South Wales Senate or upper house pre-selection, as I've learnt over many years. But for what it's worth, I think it's probably a Constance Tudor-Hope contest, and that's very interesting, especially when you consider Maurice Payne's been mates with Constance since the Young Liberals and is throwing everything at getting him her seat. But as you say, he's tried and failed the last couple of times to get into federal politics, whereas Monica Tudor-Hope's a fresh face and a woman when they want more women, and a woman is departing. So that is going to be an interesting test of the pre-selectors this Sunday. I can't wait for it, actually. I think Zed's problem is he lives in the ACT. That probably doesn't help him, Peter.
No, it doesn't. I just hope we get a Conservative, because the person who replaced Jim Molan in the Molan Senate spot was not a Conservative. So it'd be nice to even up the score. Andrew Clennell, thank you for your time. Not that I've got a dog in the race. Not that I've got a dog in the race. I'm down here in Victoria. All right, new figures out to the Federal Transport Department show that Chris Bowen's electric vehicle strategy is on track to fail. Only 27% of new car sales by 2030 will be electric. That's well below the 89% forecast by Labor before the election in modelling that helped underpin its 43% emissions reduction target. The department also estimates electric cars will only account for around 5% of the nation's small vehicle fleet by 2030, and that's a third below Labor's pre-election modelling of 15%. Now, to think Bowen, the bloke behind this modelling and these failed forecasts, is also the bloke that's running our energy infrastructure into the ground. Joining me now to get the latest on this is Head of Content at Car Expert, Scott Colley. Thank you for your time, Scott. Take us through these figures from the Department of Transport and give us a sense of what it means for Chris Bowen's EV strategy.
Well, thanks for having me, Peter. And yeah, 27% is a long way off what was forecast for 2030. It does come at a really interesting time for the electric car industry in Australia, though, because although that 27% is a long way off the mark, it comes in a year where electric car sales have grown really significantly in Australia and demand is growing as well. So a lot of what we're expecting for the next few years is going to be laid out by the amount of supply we can get, and that's tied in with emission standards. But regardless of what those standards look like and what the supply looks like, it does seem like 90% is unlikely, which even when the target was announced was something that was raised.
And Scott, I understand one of the reasons why there's been an uptick in the purchase of EV vehicles is the prices come down, and the prices come down because there's quite a significant growth in the stock out of China, the cheaper entry point vehicles. Is that right?
Yeah, so a lot of the electric cars that are on sale in Australia today are from China, and that ranges all the way from the cheapest cars on the market, which are exclusively made in China, all the way through to cars from brands like BMW and Volvo now. They're also made in China. And what we're seeing is the supply chain there is so strong, but also they've been so heavily incentivised for so long over there that it's where car makers are increasingly looking for stronger supply of their electric cars. And moving forward, it's looking likely that that is going to be the hub for manufacturing.
And of course, I've got to make the point, electric cars in Australia at the moment are actually coal-fired powered cars, because most of our grid, above 60% of it, still comes from coal-fired power. So the emissions are there, fellas, if you're a green zealot at home. Interestingly, I read something from a journalist, her name's Belinda Cleary. She did a test drive of an electric car from Sydney to Melbourne. She spent $210 on all the charging along the way, as she had to wait 3.5 hours extra in terms of the drive time to charge that vehicle. But she reports that if she was in a petrol car, it would have been a hell of a lot less, $140, and would have taken 25% less time. Do you think people are factoring that in as well?
It's definitely a reality for a lot of people that they're sort of running into as we come up to Christmas, which is when you chuck the family in the car and hit the road to go and see your extended family or go away with the kids. Electric cars work really well around the city if you can charge them at home, because you plug them in at night, you don't need to think about it, and then you leave in the morning with a full battery. But because sales have grown so quickly and because so many more people are using the public charging infrastructure, what we are seeing is when things get really busy and you do need to take a long trip, it's not as easy as it would be in a petrol car. I think one of the other challenges we're running into is that this infrastructure is still fairly new, and that means that although when it works well, there are lots of little glitches and little bits of downtime that might seem small on a spreadsheet, but if it's your family in the car and it's a 40-degree day and you're sitting there waiting, is obviously a really big issue. So there are still journeys that electric cars struggle with relative to a petrol car. It is something that the industry is working on and working hard on. But yeah, at the moment, if you are going a long way in Australia, it's still going to be easier to do in a diesel or a petrol car than it is something electric.
I was going to say too, I mean, charging at home at night is easy if you've got a driveway or a garage. But if you live in an Australian city, I mean, you know, you might be out the front, one of those car spots on the street, or you might be in a multi-storey dwelling. That's also a big challenge that I think is part of the problem here, Scott.
Absolutely it is, and it's something that the whole world is grappling with. I mean, Europe has, along with China, really been leading the charge on electric adoption, and a lot of parts of Europe are really densely populated, which means you've got things like charging ports built into lampposts. That's also something that's being explored in Sydney, but it's still very early days for that technology, and the majority of people who are buying electric cars are the ones that do have a house with a driveway or a garage and space to charge it. If we are to get to 90%, we need to solve these problems for everyone, including people who live in apartments, and we're not quite at that point yet. I know personally I don't love the idea of having to sort of dodge extension cords on my nightly run or walk home, so I'm hoping between now and 2030 we can make some progress on that front.
Well, I'm with you. I don't want to be stopped by the side of the road trying to charge up at 11:30 at night, particularly if I'm by myself as a woman. I think that sounds pretty terrible to me. I'll leave it there, Scott. Thank you for your time. All right, coming up, farmers being threatened by green activists for managing their private land, and the taxpayer, you are paying for it. Plus, Chris Bowen is now consulting Indigenous groups on energy policy. This is a First Nations energy policy. You couldn't make it up if you tried. Coming up, we'll speak to parents who say the state government must do more about the push for kids to skip school on Thursday to strike for Palestine and join the calls for the destruction of Israel. But first to our farming communities that continue to cop it at the hand of green radicals. Recently, I've been made aware that the Australian Conservation Foundation has recruited activists to troll through satellite imagery of farmers' private property looking for examples of possible land clearing. Now, countless farmers across the country then being contacted by the foundation, which has accused them of illegally clearing their land, and then lodging official complaints with Canberra-based bureaucrats in the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. The foundation even makes it clear that farmers are up for what they call serious legal penalties if they don't do what this green activist organisation says, even though the majority of landowners who've been contacted are clearing their land only for the purposes of eliminating invasive vegetation, which of course is totally legal. Joining me now to discuss this, Leader of the Federal National Party, David Littleproud. David, thank you for your time. The ACF, the Australian Conservation Fund, is a charity under the federal government rules, meaning these people who are spying on our farmers and dobbing them into the bureaucracy are getting tax deductibility from everyone watching this program tonight. Now, you've written to the government, you say there needs to be a review into the ACF's charitable status. I have to say, good on you. I can't believe no one else has taken them on before this.
Yeah, well, this isn't the actions of a charitable organisation. These are the actions of activists to actually send out threatening letters. And I've seen the letter personally. A farmer sent one to me last week, and it is threatening. It puts a timeline on the time in which they must respond. and that they have satellite imagery that they've done wrong, when in fact they've done no wrong. This is not the actions of a charity. And I wrote to the Charities Commissioner, who actually has the power to revoke their charitable status, which takes away that tax deductibility, because that's not what a charity should do. And under many of the standards of which they're meant to hold themselves to, I don't believe this is in the community interest, or one in which a charitable organisation would act. And this is where governments actually act. State governments already impose very strict vegetation management laws. And the farmer, in fact, in question that sent it to me, had a property vegetation plan with the New South Wales government, one in which they were actively working through with the New South Wales government, not with the ACF. The ACF are not the police. They are not any statutory authority. This is something that state governments actually manage and actually legislate. And in fact, we only met our Kyoto protocols because our farmers had strict vegetation management laws imposed on them. So it's internationally recognised. So I had great pleasure in writing to the Charities Commissioner and asking for the investigation into the ACF, and saying that I believe, and I think under their charter, that they have breached their charter and should no longer have that charitable status. I've subsequently received a letter back to say that they can't now, under the Act, provide me with any further information, because there is a privacy clause within that while it's under investigation. But if they do find against the ACF, then it'll be made public. So I'm waiting and hoping that the Charities Commissioner will see that they're in breach of those principles that all charities should live by.
And you're right to point out that this is all managed under state legislation. So the only authority a farmer should be mindful of if they open a letter is it's from a state government organisation talking to them about vegetation removal. If they get something from the charity, I mean, my advice would be file it in the bin. Is that what you'd say too?
Oh, exactly, but it's good that this farmer had the courage to come forward. They were distressed, I've got to say.
Oh, 100%.
When they received this letter.
100%.
They
It was
were
threatening.
really distressed that. And the tone of the letter was threatening. And even when I read it and got it sent through to me, I was actually taken back by the tone of it. And I just felt I got their consent to write to the Charities Commissioner and had a journalist ring them straight away, because I think the Australian public should know what the ACF is. They're not a charity. They're an activist group, and anyone that is actually donating money should have second thoughts. Do you really want to impose that on farming families that are going about their lawful business of producing your food and fibre in a sustainable way? Do you really think it's conscionable conduct to actually donate to this mob? So, look, I just hope the Charities Commissioner sees it within themselves to do something about this and take away that deductibility and save the Australian taxpayer a lot of money, and let the state governments get on with their job, which is to police this.
And look, rather than target farmers, I mean, where is the ACF on the issue of wind farms going in and transmission lines going in, and the damage that's doing to prime agricultural land, all the trees that come down for the wind farms, and of course all the animals? I've spoken to people up near the Daintree, conservation activists, old style ones, not this modern sort of mob, are really concerned about native species under threat. Surely that's where their emphasis should be, rather than targeting farming families.
Well, exactly, and I even had the WWF try to hand me a report card on Australian farming families about their stewardship of their land, how many trees they're knocking down. When I asked them about how many acres of native vegetation has been knocked down for renewable projects and transmission lines, and what scorecard they gave the renewable companies, there was silence. And in fact, we had a bank last week, Westpac, that came out and made a statement that they were going to impose capital bans in providing capital to farmers any farmer that cleared land beyond 2025. I had them in my office and made it very clear to them that if they wanted to go down this path, the National Party will be going down a path of regulating their banking licence. It's not up to banks to determine the laws of this land. It is up to the governments, and because governments can get elected and get unelected very quickly if they do the wrong thing. And I think it's time that we made sure we set those parameters very clear to financial institutions, but also hold them to account. I wrote a letter to the CEO of Westpac, as well as Anna Bligh, the ABA chair, asking for the policy that they would have on funding renewable projects that would be knocking down native vegetation. And when would they cease that? So if you want to have a crack at farmers, Let's put it on a level playing field. And I think these big banks showed during the Voice referendum that they're out of touch with what society expects of them. Their job is to provide capital, and they have a very privileged position in our society, and they should do it by working through the fact whether these people can repay it or not. Whether it's lawful or not is up to the government of the day, not them.
Just a quick comment. I'm almost out of time, David Littleproud. What's this story that's come out from the government? They've released a paper today about a First Nations clean energy transition. I would have thought energy's energy. Why do we need an Indigenous component to our energy plan?
Exactly. I mean, we have an energy grid, and we have energy right across this nation, and particularly for those remote Indigenous Australians in Central Australia. You are sitting on one of the biggest gas reserves in our nation's history. In fact, I have the Surat Basin in my part of the world dwarfs it, the Beetaloo Basin, and I'm sure that if you work collaboratively with those gas companies, you would see very reliable, affordable energy, and you put that with carbon capture storage, you'll have zero emission gas reliable to those communities. So I think we just need to get back to first principles. We're all Australians, and I think that referendum about a month ago said that very clearly, and the government should listen to that and listen to that very clearly.
National Party leader David Littleproud, thank you. All right, coming up after the break, I'll speak with the woman who wrote that letter that's been in the headlines all day, demanding the Victorian government do more to stop children from striking for Palestine. Plus, Argentina's just elected what is being termed their own Trump. So what do we know about him? I'll get you the details about this huge election win. Stick around. Welcome back. Coming up, we'll speak to our international panel about an attack on an Israeli ship in the Middle East by an Iranian-backed rebels who say they're fighting for Palestine. Extraordinary. But let's go to that issue in Melbourne, where thousands of parents, students and educators have signed an open letter urging the Victorian Labor government to take strong action on the School Strike for Palestine rally later this week. Here was one concerned parent on Talkback Radio this morning.
Taking time off school to protest for any reason at all is bad enough. It's certainly one where they're being used as political pawns by certain elements of our society. There's something that they have no understanding of. And with the rise in bigotry and anti-Semitism and racism that have been extremely evident around the world and here locally over the past 4 or 5 weeks, so there's a heightened risk of students attending the protest and bringing those views back to a school.
Well said, Stephen. And this comes, of course, off the back of that letter sent to the Premier and the Victorian Education Minister, Ben Carroll, calling for them to take a tough stand on the issue. The letter, written by a Melbourne Jewish mum, Moran, has already garnered over 6,000 signatures. Joining me now to discuss this, Shadow Minister for Education, Senator Sarah Henderson, and the woman who penned the letter, Moran. Moran and Sarah, thank you for your time. Moran, I'll start with you if I can. Tell us how parents and the broader Jewish community feels about these protests and the use of children in them, because something's compelled you to write a really powerful letter, and I think my audience needs to understand how tough this is.
Thanks, Peter. Look, it's been a really difficult 6 weeks for our community and for communities, Jewish communities all over the world. I'm just one community member who wrote with a few people this letter because we are so concerned and we were so worried and dismayed to hear about this rally that's being organised targeting school children. The reason we wrote the letter was because we believe that Premier Allen needs to take a much firmer stance and be quite explicit about her advice to schools and parents, which we feel should be that it is highly inappropriate and even unsafe for children and school students to be skipping school and attending this rally, which, as we know, has been organised by groups in the community who their rallies have ended with vandalism, very highly anti-Semitic tropes and placards, as well as the same group that organised the angry mob to come to Caulfield a few weeks ago, where there was tear gas and rocks thrown and arrests made. So I can't really believe, it's hard to believe that any parent would think that that's a good place for their child to go.
And that's a really fair point there, Sarah. I mean, yes, we want the Premier to take a stand. This letter calls for a clear and forceful stance on the rally. But also, you've got to say, where are the parents in all of this? These kids can't vote. I suspect most couldn't even find Gaza on a map, yet they'll be used as pawns. They'll be a recruitment vehicle for the Greens in particular. What would you do if you were the minister?
Well, Peter, great to join you. And firstly, I want to congratulate Moran for this very important initiative, which comes off the back of Premier Jacinta Allen basically green-lighting this protest by saying that students have a right to attend, a democratic right to attend this protest, when we know this is all about activism, this is all about indoctrination, and of course it's all about fueling anti-Semitism. And that's what's going to happen not just here in Melbourne, but there are other protests around the country. As a parent, I think most parents would be dismayed because classrooms are for education, not indoctrination. And frankly, the Premier has been completely irresponsible and reckless. And I've called on the Albanese government again today and the Education Minister, Jason Clare, Peter, to take a tougher stand to make it very clear that children need to be in school and they should not be used as political pawns.
Marana, it's one thing for adults, I think, to see vast numbers of people rallying on the weekend, as we've seen here and around the world. But I can't imagine what it must be like for Jewish kids to anticipate their own peers marching in the street against them. Yes, it's anti-Semitism, it's open Jew hate. That's got to be also front of mind for parents like you.
Look, that was the real driver of this letter. We're just worried about our kids. I mean, you know, what happens on Friday morning when they turn up to school and they look around and, you know, start hearing their peers talk about, you know, what they did at the rally and which signs they held. And, you know, it just really compromises their feelings of psychological and physical safety. And I think that right is much more important than the right to demonstrate or the right for free speech. But I think from our point of view, we feel like we're watching a car accident in slow motion. We know how this is going to end. We know that every one of these rallies, you know, creates a burst of anti-Semitic activity. And, you know, I think it puts a lot of pressure on schools and teachers to navigate this at school. I don't really know how they can, but, you know, we're definitely worried about how this will play out in the schoolyard. And our kids are already feeling unsafe. I mean, a lot of them, when they're on public transport, turn their jumpers inside out or, you know, change their uniform so that they're not identified as Jewish. So it's extremely difficult. I mean, you know, we know children are our most vulnerable members of the community, and it's just really saddens us to see that they have to go through this.
I mean, Sarah, honestly, you used to work at the ABC many years ago, but if people were abusing schoolgirls with hijabs on, it would be front of the newspapers, we'd all be talking about it through the national broadcaster. But somehow there is a level of silence, certainly not here on Sky News, but there's a level of silence because these are Jewish kids, and somehow it's been licensed that you could go after Jewish Australians on the back of this Israeli conflict. That's what concerns me. And again, the parents and the teachers, it's not as if Australian school standards are leading the world. They've had such a dramatic fall in recent times. We're protesting about climate change last week and now Palestine this week.
Peter, absolutely. I visited a wonderful Jewish school in Melbourne today, Mount Scopus Memorial College, and met with Year 11 students, and they spoke about their genuine fears and doing just that. Some of them are too afraid to show symbols of their faith in public. Some were very proud to wear their symbols of faith, but there is no doubt that this protest really poses a very serious risk to the safety and well-being of Jewish students, but more broadly sends the message that they don't matter in our community, and it is absolutely shocking. And as for the ABC and some of the coverage that we are seeing, as you say, if this was happening with any other sector of our community, there would be front page headlines everywhere. And it is not good enough, Peter. All students must be safe when they go to school, and parents expect them to go to school. And as you say, the school standards across Australia, with 1 in 3 students failing NAPLAN, students need every single day in school to get the best quality education, and it's absolutely appalling that this is happening. And Jacinta Allen and the Education Minister must direct schools and school principals not to allow any student to go to this protest. It must be a firm rule, and I can tell you, frankly, if this doesn't happen, if this all goes pear-shaped, which I'm sure it will, I think that the Premier's days in the top job are numbered. She, frankly, has absolutely let down all Victorians by her pathetic and irresponsible stand.
All right, we'll leave it there. Moran, thank you for your time. I want to assure you the vast majority of Australians are standing with you. I know it's particularly tough. Thank you, Sarah Henderson, as well. All right, after the break, we'll get into the big international news. Who is this Argentinian Trump? I've got some more out of the US for you, a little update on the UK and more. See you soon. All right, I'm joined now, as I am every Thursday, Tuesday. Former Labor MP Michael Danby joins me now. Sky News contributor Kosha Garda. Let's get into that news from Argentina. The Conservative outsider, Javier Milei, she will correct me, Kosha will correct me if I've got that wrong, has just been elected to the country's new president, described as a political earthquake. He calls climate change a socialist lie. He wants to end Argentina's welfare state. He's pledged to shut down the country's central bank. He even says he won't cut deals with the communists when it comes to dealing with China. Whew, not wrong with the earthquake tag.
For sure. So he has won decisively, something that's sending shockwaves around the world, 55 to 44. That's a decisive victory. He won his primary a couple of months ago with similar margins. He's a political outsider, 54 years old, was a musician, a soccer player, all sorts of things, a TV personality, and then a classical libertarian who kind of came out of nowhere and did this. And why is this capturing the world's attention? Because Argentina is a cautionary tale of a once prosperous society that can go down so quickly. Buenos Aires was one of the richest cities in the world less than a century ago. They infamously defaulted on their debt 20 years ago. They got hyperinflation, 140, 50%. Wow. We don't like it at 7% over here. Think about that. 40% of their population is below the poverty line. You put that together, and it's kind of like, what do you have to lose? And this outsider comes in like a wrecking ball, and it's going to be very interesting to watch.
Lachlan Murdoch has not long taken the top job at Fox, Sky News Australia, News Corp, all the various entities of which we are a part. But one of the first things he's done is he's gone to Ukraine and met with President Zelensky. How do you read that?
This is very significant, Peter. He's sending signals to a divided Republican Party on this very important issue. And I think he's giving the impression that America can't afford to let Russia win in the battlefield. We have to keep the Ukrainians supplied. I think the Germans could step up a bit and give them their long-range Taurus missiles. That would make all the difference. But they're doing very well on the Dnieper, on the river, and the Russian Navy has had to withdraw from the Crimean Peninsula because of those long-range American missiles.
These Houthi rebels backed by Iran boarding a ship just because it's connected to Israel. Is this a widening out of what we're seeing in the Middle East?
I think so. It sounds like that Middle East issue is a flashpoint, and the tentacles of it are just expanding ever more everywhere, domestically with all sorts of protests that we're looking at, like you covered in your previous segment, as well as militarily and just the way we see the geopolitical landscape realigning. I think just much more to come. It's hard to figure out allegiances. People are shifting sides, even that formerly we wouldn't think would do so, and it's getting messy.
Albanese can't give us a straight line. Did he raise the injury to our naval soldiers with the president 2 days after he was told, we weren't told, he was told it had happened, or didn't he? What's your take?
Beijing's communists, in my view, were testing him to see whether he would raise it and disrupt all of the good karma between Australia and China. And if he didn't, it's a mistake, Albo, because they'll push us further on something next time. They've already done the laser on the Australian aircraft, sonaring our Australian Navy divers. They push and push the envelope until they see where a country will react, because it's important for future military conflict, if there is one.
What do we need to know out of the US at the moment?
The US political landscape just now, I think the plot thickens. The lawsuits and all that continue. There's all sorts of mechanisms to try and keep Trump off the ballot that are happening, and they might fail, but that constant push is over there. On the Biden side, I think other people are circling because he's in trouble in the polls, including traditionally loyal groups like the youth or black men, groups like that are shifting several polls. And then there's this whole idea of the third party candidate. That's actually a lot of them are popping up right now or potentially might pop up, and they won't win, but they really could be material spoilers in a landscape that's so divided. The margin of victory is going to be very thin for whoever wins. So it's unprecedented, hard for anybody to predict what's going to happen, and buckle up.
15 seconds, take us home, Michael.
Houthi schmooties, it's all Iran. That's a part of the tentacle that Kosha was describing. They're really everywhere, and the Americans must stand up to them at some point.
Wow. All right. It gets scarier by the day. Thank you both for your time. All right, that's it for me. Tomorrow night, back here at 6, as you know. Up next, though, Andrew Bolt.